when we hold ourselves in the space of judgment, and when we're rigid in the space of judgment and extremely positional, we cannot keep the conversation for all points of view and all observations to occur so that we can begin to dialogue and have these difficult conversations and look at what is the next best thing that we can do? What is the next right step we can take together? Welcome to another episode of Behind Beliefs and Behaviors. You know who I am. I'm Dr. Maisha, and I am the speaker and expert of all things brain behavior and communication. And what I love most is helping organizations and communities create spaces of trust and safety through their verbal and nonverbal communication, help to connect people in their interactions. Because at the heart of everything that we move through every single day, connection is at the heart of it. And connection is what moves us through very difficult spaces. And so, how we connect is very important to me. And that is the bulk of what I teach in organizations and communities and families is how to connect, how to communicate, to connect and create trust and safety. Today, we're talking about opinions. And the reason that I want to talk about opinions today is because there's a lot of them being expressed right now, right? We are in an extremely interesting, dare I say, volatile sort of state of affairs as we come upon this election at the time of this recording. And there's just a lot of opinions being expressed. And so when we look at what an opinion is specifically from the dictionary, an opinion is a formal statement. It's a statement. It is an estimation. It is a viewpoint, not necessarily based on fact or knowledge, although it could be, but not necessarily. And it's really an expression of thinking, an expression of our thoughts. So opinion comes from the root to opine, to the verb to opine. And to opine just means to think. It's to think, to comment, to remark upon, to propose, to suggest. To opine is the verb, and then an opinion is an expression of that thinking. And so the question then becomes, from where are we opining, right? What is the space? What is underneath the opinion? Is it a judgment? Is it an observation? Or is it a point of view? Really, spectrums of interconnected of the same thing, right? So there's judgments, there's observations, there's point of view. And I'm going to distinguish it because, again, it's interconnected. There's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of gray area, but it's important to get the world as you're speaking from day to day. Oftentimes we're speaking and we're not always aware of the filters through which we're speaking. And we're not always aware of the filters through which we're listening as well. So as we communicate, we're forming these opinions. And as we communicate, the communication is an outward expression of the thought that we have in our minds. And so what is the space from which you're expressing yourself? Now, is it the space? Is it the space of observation? And observation is simply naming something that you see or hear or experience, perhaps, right? Naming something you see, hear, or experience. Now, we need to understand, because I think before I go deeper into this topic, we need to understand that most of the time when we're listening out of the binary, and I speak about this a lot when I talk about listening in various trainings and organizations, like how we're set up, how we're socialized to listen is through the binary, the right, the wrong, the good, the bad, the valid, the invalid, the true, the false, the waiting to make our own point, right? to assess and to judge. So this is the way we're socialized and we're set up to listen and to express. And so even an observation is a matter of perception. An observation is through our own filters. So, is it an observation, which is naming something that you see, hear, or experience? Now, it could potentially be the most neutral way to express it as an observation. And then it invites for another's observation, right? Now, we could also say, are we expressing it from a point of view, right? Speaking about your own perspective, which again, very similar to an observation. Observation is something that you're naming in the moment that you notice, see, hear. But the point of view is about your perspective. So it's your interpretation of something, right? So you have what you see, hear, experience, and then, or what you notice, and then the point of view, which is what your interpretation of that noticing is. And we want to be mindful, like, which of these are we speaking from when we're expressing an opinion to someone else? And then there's a judgment. And the judgment is adding a story or a generalization or a mind read to your observation or point of view, usually based on some belief or emotion. And it's typically not, it can typically be very positional, and often it can be personal. And judgments can actually land for others in a very kinesthetically, in a very negative way. When I say kinesthetically, it gives them that, it can give a bad feeling in the body. And so we want to just make sure that when we're expressing ourselves and we're expressing our opinions, what are we expressing it from? From an observation, from a point of view, or from a judgment? And it's not that any of these are wrong per se. We want to take the case that everything holds a polarity, everything happens on a spectrum, right? If we think that, if we because we often are socialized to the binary, we don't recognize that everything has a polarity, and which means that there's a both and for everything, not necessarily everything is an either or. But in order to be able to hold the space for the polarity or the both and, you have to recognize where you already are and shift yourself. So, the benefit of knowing whether you're speaking from or listening from a judgment, listening from your perspective, or actually noticing something, the benefit of that is to be able to shift from a space of judgment, which really is positional and can be very rigid, to a more flexible space where a conversation can be opened up, where discussion, where conflict can be resolved, where disagreements can be resolved. And that is in moving from judgment to point of view, and even recognizing that your perspective or your point of view is just that, your point of view. Even your observation, recognizing it's your observation. But when we can move from judgment to point of view and observation, then it opens us up to be willing to hear another's observation or point of view. Because remember, we all have our own mental models that we carry around every single day. We all have the model of the world based on our past experiences, based on our socialization, based on our culture, based on historic marginalization, depending on your birth luck, right? So we all have our own models of the world that we carry around. And when we move from judgment, which is extremely positional, and we move into recognizing point of view, our own point of view, and observation of ourselves, right? So observing ourselves in our point of view and observing that there's another point of view over there that could be valid. And it doesn't mean you have to necessarily buy into or submit to another's point of view or observation. What it means is when you can actually shift from positional to point of view to noticing, then when you begin to have these conversations, you can, especially when you're on opposing views and you're on opposing views, then you can actually hold the space for the polarities and that two things can be true. And it's really less about who's right and who's wrong, what's better or what's worse, what's true or what's false. And it's more about the values that each person is bringing from their point of view and from their own noticing experience and observation. And when we can begin to get inside of that conversation, then people can find that commonality. And so I think that a really good example of this is what we're seeing inside of this election space, particularly as it pertains to the genocide that's happening in Zion and Palestine, and the opinions around voting for Kamala Harris or the other party. And so there's a lot of positioning around, particularly Black people voting for Kamala and also being pro Palestinian, and that those two things cannot exist together. But here is where the polarity stands, is that when we're in that space of judgment, when we're in that space of positionality, then we can't see the polarities. We can't see the two things can be true. And when we are in that space of judgment and we're very rigid in our own point of view about what's right and what's wrong, then we can't hold the complexity of the issues and understand that there are multiple issues to be considered. And so I think it's important for us to look at it from this point of view of where are we speaking from and where are we not holding the space of complexity and holding space for contradiction, understanding that there is no binary, there is no absolutes. It just doesn't exist. Name the example of the election and what's going on, but you can take this into any area. You can take this into your organizations and look at where is the polarity. I'll give you another example just from an organizational and industry standpoint in medicine. There is our administrators, and then there are our clinicians, and there has developed an us versus them type of environment, and where the administrators are making decisions and not necessarily asking or including the voices of the clinicians, and then and the clinicians are experiencing that and feeling that, and it can spark burnout, it can spark anger, it can spark resentment. And then what happens is there's this binary us versus them, and the administrators may have a point of view that is, we need to make sure in order to keep this hospital open that we make a certain amount of revenue. And yet the clinicians are saying, yes, however, number one, we don't see half of that revenue, we don't see half of that money. And number two, it's at the cost of, it's at the debt to the detriment of not only our well being, but it ultimately can impact the well being of our patients because it impacts our ability to show up the way we want to show up. And we burn out. And then you see from a big picture, from the observer point of view, you see a bunch of doctors who are leaving medicine. And so the polarity is that, yes, a hospital needs to be able to make money to stay open. And also, the clinicians' voices need to be included and the clinicians need to be taken care of so that they can show up in the best way that they need to show up for their patients, right? And also, again, including more of the polarity, and we need to consider what is best for the community, what is best for patient care, what is best for health equity. So there are all of these things, all of these multiple issues to consider, and it's not a binary thing. And when we hold ourselves in the space of judgment, and when we're rigid in the space of judgment and extremely positional, we cannot keep the conversation for all points of view. and all observations to occur so that we can begin to dialogue and have these difficult conversations and look at what is the next best thing that we can do? What is the next right step we can take together? Together. Because judgment and positionality is what divides us. It's what divides us. But when we begin to dialogue, and if you think about the word dialogue, it's that dia, that dia, that's two, right? Two or more. When we dialogue, monologue, that's uno, that's one, right? We dialogue, that's two or more, then we can work through the mud. And I think a lot of times people don't want to have those difficult conversations, feel uncomfortable in the body, difficult conversation. Think things can get intense. And when people can't regulate themselves, when they don't have the skills or they're unwilling to regulate themselves emotionally, then it really can become toxic. It can become traumatic. And so, we're on a one hand, there's a lot of the high intense emotions, which, if again, you plant your feet in positionality, then it's very difficult to hold space for the emotion and hold space for another's point of view. But when you shift yourself from judgment to opening to others' point of view and to no shifting into observation, like my view is one view, there's another view that I can listen to, and then we can begin to dialogue through those difficult conversations, leaning into the emotions, naming the emotions, observing the emotions of others, and dancing inside of the conversation. Last week, I talked about communication being a dance. And so, dancing inside of those conversations and being with each other and holding space for all of it, for the all of it inside of those conversations, respectfully. And that's a key word as well, respectfully and even compassionately, as compassionate as one can, with empathy, so that solutions can be met. And that goes for whether we're talking on a world view, we're talking on an organizational view, and we can even bring it down into the community and the family unit, parenting, relationships, friendships. So this actually holds power and holds validity from whatever context, large or small context, that you apply it. So I think that is the main thing that I wanted to share, is this space of when you're expressing yourself, when you're expressing your opinion, being mindful of where is it coming from? What filters are you speaking through? And are you planting your feet, digging your feet in the ground to be it in positionality? Or are you willing to consider to shift to a point of view and shift to observation in order to keep the conversation open to dialogue for the betterment of the whole? Because I guarantee that you have your story and your story is valid, and the other person has their story and their story may be valid as well. And we can't endeavor to understand another unless we actually listen to them. So, with that said, these are the conversations that I have. These are the kinds of discourses and dialogues that I facilitate. And in my communication coaching and training, I teach people how to move into these spaces and sit with whatever that discomfort might be and how to regulate in that space so that you can keep the conversation open. And I do that at the level of organization. And then I teach, of course, I teach that in my course and my coach training program. So if you're wondering, how can I learn more about bringing me either into an organization to have these conversations or to teach and train expanded tools of communication, of listening, of emotional regulation, then this is a place where you can invite me in and let's talk about what would it look like? What would it look like? What is that you need? What is it that's missing? And we can look at what that I offer? What are the tools that I can teach, and how might that look inside of your organization? And if you are an individual, if you are a coach, if you are a consultant and you're like, I really want to learn and expand my language and my capacity inside of my consulting, inside of my coaching, then I invite you to reach out and let's talk a little bit about what training, like certifying in this discipline, looks like as well. All right. Because I do have certification programs. So, with that, I look forward to hearing your thoughts about this topic today. Remember to share this if you are on the live platform with me. Share this in on your social media, reshare, repost, and allow others to be able to hear and see this conversation, because I think it's important for us to really dig into the nuances and the intricacies of how we communicate so that we can begin to dismantle a lot of the division that's happening. And that's what we need to do, right? Dismantling division and cultivating in connection, right? Dismantling division and cultivating connection. That is what we need to do. And so, with that, share this with a friend, a colleague, a family member, repost it on your social media. And if you want to hear more episodes like this, then I invite you to go to your Spotify, to go to your Apple Podcast, YouTube podcast we are now on, and to look up Behind Beliefs and Behaviors podcast, and go ahead and subscribe, and you can hear lots more episodes. Of course, I do these solo episodes, but I also do episodes and dialogues with guests, because again, while I love bringing these different topics in monologue, essentially, in this case, I also love bringing it in dialogue as well. So I welcome comments and look forward to the next time. Until then, though, stay empowered.